Welcome to the Aid Market Podcast, where foreign aid partners connect to learn about key funding trends and market insight. The podcast is co-hosted by Aid Connect Data, the pipeline and market intel software for USAID partnering, and Konektid International, the leading USAID partnering support consulting firm. Now, here's your host, Mike Shanley.
Hello, and welcome to the Aid Market Podcast. Very excited to start the conversation today on USAID growth strategies, discussing everything from bootstrapping your firm to getting external investment and discussing mergers and acquisition in the USAID market. Our guests today are Keith Ives, the co-founder and CEO of Causal Design, and Santiago Sedaca, the president of Empower Development. Santiago, let me get your firm right here. President of Empower International Development. Santiago was the chief investment officer at DT Global and was president of Corona during the acquisition by Palladium. Later in the show, we'll hear from Edward Williams, a partner at Williams LLP, on the legal considerations when looking at M&A in the USAID market, including if you're an international entity, say based in Europe and looking to acquire a USAID partner. And then we'll wrap it up with Christy's Corner, hearing from Christy Hollywood, Konektid's chief operating officer, on what are the key takeaways from this conversation? What's the so what for USAID business development teams and new partners? With that, I'd like to first welcome Keith in here. And again, Keith has built Causal Design from as a consultant and a bootstrap consulting firm to now a prime holder of USAID's Eval.me IDIQ. So Keith, if we could start with you and just share a bit of your story. What was it like in those early years? Was it an intentional move to build a firm, or did you kind of fall backwards into a contract and realize, hey, we got a consulting firm here?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It was intentional and unintentional at the same time. I think it's probably helpful to know the longer history of how I got there in the first place. You know, I was graduating high school right as the U.S. military was invading Iraq, and as I left high school, I enlisted in the Marine Corps and joined that fight. And you know, from there up until today, almost every decision I've made in my life, my career has really been focused around passion and problem solving. And after I left the Marine Corps, I got into humanitarian logistics, working with the Red Cross and then Doctors Without Borders overseas. And I actually remember my first kind of humanitarian operation was in Haiti after the earthquake in 2010. Fast forward to 2013, 2014, in international development, we have really the wave of effective altruism starting to hit, where we're looking at international development, our foreign assistance budgets and NGOs, and going, hey, it's not just good intentions, but we also need to be using evidence. We need to know that it works. We need to be testing and experimenting to find better ways to optimize our dollars when there aren't enough dollars to solve all of the challenges in the world. And I saw that movement happening in international development, but I didn't see it hitting, especially the research and evidence generation, hitting on the humanitarian side as well. Typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda hit the Philippines in 2013, and in the wake of that, myself and my co-founder Raymar, we were leaving graduate school at Georgetown, and we said, hey, we've got an idea on how we could really do some interesting research that would help us know how to do this better in these disaster contexts. And that was the genesis. It wasn't because we wanted to be contractors or build a big business. It was that we had a research idea on how we thought we could improve the efficiency in foreign assistance delivery.
And then how'd you get from that point, the idea? And I think I talk to people all the time where, hey, I got an idea for a company there, or the market needs this or this. There's always one thing that this is what we think that you think the market needs. Yeah. How'd you then take that to starting? Well, what was the first step? How'd you get that first contract to really start building a firm from?
Yeah, Mike, I think you mentioned this in some of the other materials, but we really bootstrapped it. And we started by going door to door. using those insoles and knocking on the doors of the research and policy offices of a lot of your top humanitarian organizations and saying, this is something we're passionate about. This is something we think will help your operations. Is it something you're interested in? And to this day, I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity that the research team at Mercy Corps gave us. John Kurtz, the senior director there, gave us an opportunity, and the rest is really history. From there, I think today we've done, I think we're getting into the 60s in the number of research contracts we've supported Mercy Corps with and their operations globally, and expanded that to Save the Children, Catholic Relief, a lot of the usual suspects in the implementing partner community at USAID. I'd back up, though, to say that from a business perspective, we started as individuals. Raymar and I both leveraging, individual contracts that often a lot of procurement teams are willing to give out more flexibly. They're able to give smaller individual contracts with fewer procurement steps than a large, massive $1 million research contract. And that's how we got our foot in the door. And if you're going to bootstrap, it's going to be about relationships. And, I think that applies to really any business, but especially, when you're bootstrapping, you have to build those relationships because that's how you're going to get your work.
And so how did you all then grow that? You kind of say it just happened magically. Obviously, there's a lot of hustle and effort behind that. So great.
Yeah.
You get that first step, go to your relationships, find that first small sub opportunity or direct opportunity working with a prime. How do you all become a prime holder on a USAID IDIQ from there?
Yeah, I think the first and most important part is if you want to be a prime contractor, you have to ignore the prime contracts. And the first step is really selling to, that top 10 list of USAID grantees and contractors. Building the relationship with Chemonics and with Palladium and with Bluemont on the grant side, Save the Children, Mercy Corps, those actors, selling to them because today as we bid as a prime, the most important part of those bids is one, our knowledge of the client, which we've gained by working as a subcontractor and sub-grantee, a sub-awardee, and as well as that past performance. And there's a bit of that chicken and egg. It's a bit of I think it's described as a make it, take it game often in government contracting. You have to get the past performance. And the way that we did that, and I think the way that I've seen a lot of our peer firms do that, is building that relationship and selling to the prime implementing partners first, building a reputation there, building a portfolio there, and learning. It's the safe place to learn, not just about what USAID needs and the opportunities and innovations that you can move into in the field, your chance to see what the challenges are that you can solve, but it's also your chance to learn about compliance, to learn about contracts, learn about teaming agreements. It's the on-the-job training for when you switch from the passenger seat to the driver's seat and need to be the one leading in those areas.
So it sounds like it's those relationships with the primes that really were maybe top priority, maybe secondarily. Just behind that is understanding U.S. government procurement processes, cost and pricing, contracts, all that, compliance. How do you make those connections with the primes? What are some things that you all found effective?
Yeah, the industry events are critical. I don't know if you're in the evaluation space, we're all going to AEA, the American Evaluation Association Conference in Indianapolis next month. So if you're there, find me there. Let's talk. But the USAID small business events, the next one I think coming up is in Thailand in November. Again, if you can get into one of these events, please do go. And if you're in Thailand, you're in Bangkok in November, find me, let's talk. But going to those events, we're a service-disabled veteran-owned firm. USAID used to hold an event just for veterans trying to work in international development. They haven't in a few years, but it was at that event that I first met an executive from MSI, who's a large and successful contractor in our space, and they were actually one of the first large primes to pull us in and go, hey, why don't you join our bid on a MELA, a service contract with USAID in Afghanistan. It's those relationships at those events, the corp capes, as they call it, your 1 or 2 pager of your company and what you're going to do to help the client. Those are really important, but knowing the name and the email address to send it to is the necessary condition.
Yeah, we hear that a lot, actually, especially from European clients, that with the USAID market, it's much more informal networking relationship based than other aid donor markets, where really it's almost applying for the grant is your last step, that you got to know someone, meet them face to face, talk, have that relationship before you get to that point. All right, Keith, so say we,
absolutely right. Yeah, I agree. And I would just add again, this from the sub and prime role, we're always flipping, but our first big prime bids, we actually led because a large contractor with experience, knowledge of the client, knowledge in the terrain came to us and said, "Hey, are you interested in leading this? Because we'd love to support your bid." And that's actually how we got mentored in to this role in many ways.
So what would your advice, say we have a consultant listening now who's, interested in building a firm and is looking to go the similar route, take a contract, maybe a follow on, put their firm on there, bring on a couple 1099 consultants and build it from there. What advice would you have for someone both on the pros and cons of whether it's the right fit and then, what they should be thinking about at that stage?
Yeah. Mike, some of this I think is universal to any business. First, know your why. Why are you doing this? What are the outcomes that you're targeting? If you're just trying to build a big GovCon firm and make some money and increase your EBITDA and then sell it, you could probably do it. But there are a lot of other government agencies that it's going to be a lot easier and a lot more profitable to do that in. USAID, half their budget goes to grants and awards. About 50-60% of our portfolio at Causal Design are actually grants where we're not allowed, and we get audited annually, we're not allowed to generate net income. There's no profit there. Causal Design, the reason we started Causal Design, the reason that we built this firm was to create cultures of evidence within the foreign assistance community. That's our goal. And so you really need to know what your outcome is. The next step is you have to learn the FAR. No other business in the world do you need to understand the FAR. That's a very unique only to GovCon, but it's everything. Your large business primes, they're not going to understand the FAR as it relates to you as a small business. Oftentimes, even your contract officer, COR at USAID, isn't going to know or be aware of the small business concerns, the exceptions and special rules for small businesses. You have to become an expert in the FAR. You learn that by going to industry events, by talking to peer firms. I'll give a shout out to SBAIC, the Small Business Association of International Contractors. A lot of my education, when it was just two of us, came from those events and learning from folks who'd already been down this road. It's a community event. You have to learn from the people around you.
And let me just jump in. FAR, that's the federal acquisition regulations. And then there's the ADARs, the I guess subset of that applies to USAID, but basically the compliance regulations to follow. And SBIC, definitely, if you're looking to go to the small business route, a good organization to be associated with. So moving
Mike, just before
please.
we pivot from there, sorry to interrupt, but one more piece that I wished we'd done earlier. I wish we would have gotten a set of reviewed financials at the very beginning. We waited probably 5 years to get our first set of independent CPA reviewed financials, which allows you to establish the indirect cost rates that you can use with government. And it was a game changer, both in our negotiation with primes, when we tried to set our rates and they'd always push back. And then we came with our reviewed financials and they said, oh, okay, fine. And even now as a prime, when we talk to USAID and we already have those sets of financials, it just expedites it, pushes everything through, and it gives you a lot more voice.
And Keith, that leads to a next important question that we have all the time with clients who are looking to enter and grow in the market. How do you balance that federal regulation preparedness versus business development? Where do you focus on building your pipeline? And all right, once you get a subcontract, now here's all the things you should do after that, versus here are all the things you got to do now and really invest in upfront before you even have funding. How did you balance that with your team?
I go back to having a co-founder, honestly. There's an old saying, I think Dave Ramsey originally came up with it, something along the lines of, the only ship that doesn't sail is a partnership. Having a partner is really hard. It's difficult. At Causal Design, from the very beginning, we had clear lanes of responsibility between me and Raymar. And Raymar has delivered all of our work to date. And I have chased the new business. I've done our sales. I've managed our relationships, and I've also ensured that we're building infrastructure for compliance. But I think to some extent separating those pieces and making sure that somebody has a growth vision and is out there really trying to grow the firm, while someone else can be completely focused on doing it well, doing it right, doing it compliantly, crossing the T's and dotting the I's. It's been really successful for us, and it's the way I would recommend folks do it moving forward.
Great. And then the last question for you, Keith, is on market visibility. So the other piece of this is great. You're doing excellent work. Does anyone know about it? When we talked about the importance of networking, how do you, at this point, think about market visibility? Is there anything you would have done earlier on for building more relationships, sponsoring conferences? And again, that's kind of the third thing. At what point should people start looking at sponsoring events and coming on podcasts like this and getting on other webinars?
Yeah, I think we're at a turning point now, honestly. We're about 25, 26 full-time employees. We have a local office in Cambodia, another one in Malawi, and then our home office here in Denver, as well as an office in DC. We're just now at that place where I think the individual relationships are still critical and they're important, but it's not about knowing Keith anymore. It's really about knowing Causal Design. And when you're at that point where the brand is starting to expand beyond the individual or the personality, that's when you need that conference appearances, conference hosting, podcasts, brand. You need someone managing your LinkedIn and getting that visibility out there, because it's at that point when you're starting to bid on more opportunities and potentially even on things where you don't know the contracting officer, you don't know the prime, but you want them to know your brand. And you don't want them to be surprised and go, "Who? Causal?" Yeah, we're like, "Oh yeah, I heard that podcast." So I think right now is that turning point. I think it would have been not a waste of money, but it would have been too soon for us to invest in that any earlier than now.
I think that's a great way to put it. Once you move to being a firm from an individual, great. And Keith, let me just note, you noted you're a veteran-owned small business. I do hear conversations that there aren't any USAID partners or not enough. Let's just note that there is Causal Design is a veteran-owned USAID small business with past performance in the market. So, I know that's a message you like to get out there. So just want to make sure we take this opportunity to highlight that and amplify it.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. And that's right. The last 20 years, it's a target, a congressionally obligated small business target that USAID, I think, has only reached twice. They're usually not even within 10% of their goal. There is a sole source authority. So if you're a contracting officer or COR out there listening, service-disabled veterans can get sole sources up to $4 million. And I'd love to see USAID move to doing set-asides the way that they've so successfully done with women-owned small businesses, to grow and really invest in that diversity in their vendor pool.
Great. Well, thanks, Keith. Let's move on next. Santiago, if we could bring you in here. Santiago Sedaca, he's a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic International Studies, also the president of Empower International Development. Santiago is also, as I mentioned earlier, the former chief investment officer at DT Global, oversaw 2 key acquisitions while there, and is the former president of Karana, and was president when Palladium acquired them. Santiago, let's if we could just have you kind of set the stage. When you think about mergers and acquisition, M&A in the USAID market, could you talk a little bit about, what comes to mind for you for that?
What comes to mind is that most people don't know too much about it. Most of us are like Keith and like me. We're development professionals. We care about having impact, and we came into it because we want to change the world through the work that we're doing. And so, as Keith was saying, most people are not coming in to be able to roll up a company or a bunch of companies and then sell them for a mega profit. They're thinking about the work that they're going to be doing. And that's the reality for most people, definitely employees, certainly the owners as well. And that's who I was up until 2016 or thereabouts, when I was at Karana and I was the president of Karana. We had just had some of our peak years in 2012, 2013. We had hit about $50 million worth of revenue. And the market started changing. USAID started having larger and larger procurements. They were perceived to be more complicated in being implemented. We are a proud and very good and very effective economic development consulting firm that had been in the market for 30 years, 31 years actually. And but there was a bit of a perception inside USAID, nothing that ever gets written down anywhere, but there was a perception that only large firms could implement some of the most interesting work that was being bid out at that time. And we got tired of coming in second in a lot of bids. We were doing the organic growth, and we had done rather well. But we came to a decision when we came to know a company that became Palladium that we had been working with to enter the UK market, that maybe together we would be perhaps more successful in getting to implement the most interesting projects out there. So we made a very hard decision. I was the junior partner. I was the president. The CEO was Eduardo Tugendhud. He was the senior partner. And we said, look, if we want our people to grow, if we want to be able to do the most innovative programming, we need to do something different. And we've been preaching for 30 years that companies need to listen to the market. Man, we need to listen to the market as well. So all of a sudden, a year later, we were part of Palladium, and we were writing the same proposals. We weren't any smarter. We had the same team. I wasn't any prettier. I had a little bit less hair. But instead of coming in second, we were starting to come in first a lot. And in about 3.5 years or so, we won about $350, $400 million worth of work. And we really had, I think, the most exciting economic growth portfolio of any contractor in the USAID space. It was at Palladium that I got involved in the acquisition of a small firm called Include, which had also been a partner to both Corona and Palladium in different bids and in projects. And with them, they were a small firm. We won some very interesting work in innovative financing. They would never have won that work alone. We probably would not have won it without their quals and their people. So it's a classic case of 1 + 1 = 4. Fast forward 3 or 4 years later, I was the chief investment officer at DT Global, as you mentioned. And part of the reason I was brought in was to help develop an economic growth practice. But we realized very quickly that growing that practice organically was going to take a while. And so what we decided was, let's go talk to companies that could possibly join DT Global. And I spent about 14 months talking to dozens of companies, mostly in the US, but worldwide, about the possibility of being acquired. And soon enough, we were buying IMC Worldwide, which was one of the top 10 contractors in the UK aid space, which did a lot of infrastructure, education, some EG work as well. Both presence in the UK as well as the presence in the US, with not just USAID but with MCC. And in just a matter of weeks, we acquired Cardno International Development, which was the largest implementing partner in Australian aid, with a significant economic growth presence with USAID. Within a matter of weeks, we went from being $150 million in revenue to about $450, $500 million, one of the largest pure play international development companies in the world. And that happened through acquisitions. We never would have would have had that accelerated type of growth.
So I want to get into two things here, both the perspective of selling as well as acquiring. So from the selling standpoint, let's go back to the Corona time. If you're a CEO, had a good growth year, and one is maybe start with that. You mentioned revenue. Where does the valuation come from? If someone is at the point and they're looking to sell, is it the backlog? Is it revenue? Is it just market positioning and it's seen as a growing piece of the USAID market? But from what you've learned going through that process of selling, what should you be doing internally as a firm to prepare to sell? And what about externally? How did you start making those contacts? You said you already had a relationship with Palladium. I do hear that when I see acquisitions and then you kind of trace it back. It wasn't two people that didn't know each other coming together and decided to make an acquisition, but often there's a backstory of often years of working together to know that that's a good fit. So if you could talk a little bit about what's going on when you are trying to sell.
Sure. Well, if I may back from that in saying that the key issue that we have in the marketplace right now is that people do not think about this and do not even think about selling as a prospect or as a possibility. And that I think that is harmful to the ecosystem because there's not the shaping and the reshaping of companies that could be happening to be able to create even better implementing partners for USAID and all the other agencies out there. And it's because most people, they like what they're doing and they don't, want to be thinking about selling. They almost think of it as a dirty thing or, something that's not holy enough in the development space. But the reality is that if you're not thinking about exiting, you're actually putting not just yourself, but a lot of people you may love and you might have grown with and might have been able to develop as professionals in a pretty awkward situation once you may decide to retire or other key people retire or the market changes. Thinking about an exit or thinking about partnerships is something that can provide opportunities for not just for yourself to monetize the good work that you might have produced over a number of years, but also to provide career opportunities and the opportunity to do even better development work. So it can actually be a mission-driven decision, not just a financial decision. Having said that, you do want to set yourself up as best as you can. In terms of the Corona situation, we didn't do the classic thing that people do, which is to go out and shop themselves around to talk to a number of companies. We used to get a number of companies coming in, and we used to kick them out the door because we were too good to talk to anyone about selling our company until we decided.
Jumping in there, Santiago, do you think that approach helped with the valuation of, oh, wow, these guys must be great if they don't want to sell? Or did that turn off some potential buyers?
I don't know. I really don't know. I can speculate on that, but I shouldn't. But I'll tell you how you should do it or what you should be doing to answer your question, which is, look, at the end of the day, in terms of what's going to drive your valuation is going to be several factors. First of all, net income. You can't escape net income, and some sort of a multiplier around what is your income or your EBITDA. Different acquirers will care more about net income versus EBITDA. Obviously, if you're in a growth space, everybody's been wanting to get into health for the last 15 years, or people have been trying to crack into education and it's really hard, or climate, if you get some real quals in, related to climate financing, adaptation, mitigation, and so on, those are seen as growth areas. You'll probably be able to get a higher multiplier than if you're in a highly competitive environment where, there's not likely to be a lot of growth. I don't think that, having a presence in Afghanistan is going to be the thing that's going to get you a high multiplier. So also the countries that you're in, right? Are you in markets? Are you in missions where, it's likely that budgets are going to be growing. So all those things matter. The perception in the marketplace about you, what sorts of quals do you have? What sorts of contract mechanisms do you have? Oftentimes, companies are very specific about acquiring other companies that have a specific mechanism that would otherwise take a long time to acquire. OTI is famously hard to get into. And so companies that have those mechanisms, whether small or large, have a real asset there. And obviously reputation. If your reputation is good, if your people are good, then it's going to be a lot easier for the acquirer to see what you don't generally want to be buying a company, although some people do this just to get that very specific revenue number added onto your own revenue. You want 1 + 1 to equal 3 or 5 or 10 or 20, right? And so if you have good people in the company that you're looking at acquiring, then the idea is that you put the quals together, the capabilities together, the business intelligence together, and you might be able to create something really special. And that should be the mindset of both of the acquirer and of the company being acquired, particularly if you really care about what you've been building over, a number of years.
So take us behind the scenes a little bit, Santiago. How do those conversations happen? Is it working relationships and then you kind of start talking and realizing, hey, this might make sense to explore a deeper partnership, perhaps like a full acquisition or merger? Or how does that happen? And then also you want to comment at all on, we're talking about mainly consulting firms for profits here. How does this work in the NGO space? Can the consulting firms, should they be looking at acquiring NGOs? So if you want to share your thoughts on that.
Let me stay on the for-profit. It gets a little more complicated when you get into the NGO space, particularly if it's a for-profit with an NGO. I think Edward might be able to speak to that a little bit later. But let me stay on there's two mechanisms, I would say, that there's two ways in which this generally happens. One is through these conversations that you're describing, right? And you start talking about, hey, what do you want to be doing 5 years from now or 10 years from now if you're the acquirer? And you try to have coffee, you have a conversation with someone that there's a level of trust that you want to be able to have, or probably you would have those conversations with companies that you admire. You like what Keith is doing, and you say, yeah, we would like to be able to have some of those capabilities in-house. And I like Keith, I could see working with Keith and so on. So that is one way. That is how the Corona acquisition or the Corona sale on our side took place. Another way is a more structured sale. So there is, most M&A in the world, actually, in larger company settings, happens through some sort of an auction or some sort of a process where a number of companies are invited to come and take a look at your financials, some sort of a presentation, a deck that gets professionally put out, and then companies are invited to bid for such a company. It's a totally different mechanism. Some people think that you might be able to get a better price that way because you got more companies vying for you. Although I've seen experiences where the other way works as well. There are there's a few people who are dedicated to actually help companies come to market and that are kind of market makers in this space. The market's kind of shallow. There's not a lot of service providers very specifically for M&A services because there's not a lot of movement necessarily. But there's a few, And I get calls to help out on that every once in a while, just because I've come at it from my very specific experiences. But that's generally how it happens. When it comes to the NGO side, I would say I would speak more on the NGO with NGO kind of conversation, which is kind of a more like conversation to the one that I just described. Those conversations tend to happen where oftentimes board members are involved, and they are talking about scale being something that's important, particularly in this time for a number of NGOs. Complementarity of markets and donors and so on. Those are the types of things that are interesting. Who's going to have a job left, and who those sorts of things really matter, both in any of the situations. But I know that those are particularly important in the NGO to NGO conversation. There are advisors that actually specialize more on the NGO mergers than in acquisitions, than because there's some different legalities around it. So that's how those conversations tend to go, and I've been part of some of those.
Now, Santiago, something that comes up in I think every single show we do, and just about every conversation with clients, is localization. Right. What trends are you seeing in the M&A market for USAID? And then how is localization playing into that?
Good question. I think that localization, I have not seen localization per se be a driver for mergers and acquisitions. So that would be my straight answer. Maybe there's something I don't know, but it hasn't been necessarily what I've seen in the marketplace. How I could see it playing out is that a merger, an acquisition that creates a company that has more tentacles in more places, with more relationships in deep relationships in Colombia, deep relationships in Nigeria, deep relationships in Jordan, places that are going to be most impacted by the localization agenda, because they have healthy budgets and very good companies, organizations, NGOs that are going to be able to be prime contractors or grantees for USAID. I think that those would be considerations. Coming back to your earlier question, what else beyond net income matters? I think those would be considerations when you're saying, oh yeah, this company, this institution is attractive because they can help us in developing deep, meaningful relationships in some of these markets that are important for USAID or for other agencies.
So, kind of the third piece of this, bootstrapping, M&A, is investment, VC investment, private equity, individual angel investing. Is that a big piece in the market? What role do you see that? And at any point in your work, had you all thought about that as a mechanism for growth in the USAID market?
That's very interesting that you asked that, Mike. I've had conversations with people about that. There have been some, try not to get into specific names in transactions, but people with deep pockets have bought other some significant firms, but it hasn't been the biggest driver, let's say. So in other markets, let me put it in this contrasting terms. In other markets, even in GovCon, you will have funds and players that will have a roll-up sort of strategy to be able to start acquiring a number of firms. You roll them up, and it starts looking like a prettier, healthier, more profitable firm together, and then you're able to sell it off. That hasn't really happened within this market. And part of the reason is that I believe is the low margins, the low net income margins that you find in our international development space. So, I think to get even more specific, there's a number of dynamics. So if you buy a bunch of firms, all of a sudden these firms, you put them all together, they now have $40 million in revenue altogether. Instead of having a competitive advantage, they might be at a competitive disadvantage because they no longer have the small business status. So if you're going to have a roll-up strategy, you probably want to have something that's going to get into, the over 100 million, 150 million. You're not necessarily going to be going out and looking at a whole bunch of firms that are making 5% in net income a year. If you're going to be having that type of take and go through that effort, probably need something that's going to make more money than that. So I think that that's probably one of the dynamics as to why that hasn't happened. Also, right now, interest rates are pretty high. So, in order to be able to have that type of a strategy, it makes it, you need an even better net income case for such a strategy to pay off, unless you think that interest rates or net income is going to go up or interest rates are going to be coming down anytime soon.
Okay. Can I bring Keith? Can you come back in here? I'm interested in your take on, as you're operating day to day, running a growing small business in the space. Yeah. And I imagine most of your focus and effort is just on the next proposal coming up, operations, growing the firm. But did you have any thoughts that came up as you listened to kind of Santiago talk through his experience, both from the selling side and the acquisition side and operations?
Yeah. I mean, so many things that he said. It was great to hear because it's resonated with my intuition and experience in building Causal. But one is the rates and the fee, that net income. It's hard. USAID is a hard place to make a competitive net income margin compared to with Causal Design. We could go and sell the same product. We could go and do randomized trials, impact evaluations, cost benefit, cost effectiveness analysis for the VA tomorrow, or DoD, or HHS, or even USDA, places where we still feel like they align with our mission, but it's a different context in different communities. And we could double, probably triple our net income on the same type of work. So that is tricky, and I liked that example of rolling up to 40 million just means you lose your small business advantage, but rolling up to 140 million, I think that mirrors what we've seen, the conversations that we've had with other organizations. One piece that I really like that you mentioned, I believe Amy had a conversation in the Q&A about as well, is the culture when you roll up those firms and the frictions of doing that. And I have friends who've been acquired and seen this go well and seen it go poorly. But one thing that I do love about the USAID culture is that you get to trial run this. You get to subcontract, potentially with some of these large firms that might acquire you, or other small firms that you might acquire. When you go in on teaming agreements and you go in on bids and contracts together, this is your opportunity to test run, to court, and have that relationship and see how you work together.
Absolutely. And so even if you get into a bid process, price is not necessarily what's going to win out. And I'm not going to get into specifics but I can mention that there are transactions that take place where it's not necessarily the highest bidder that gets the company that's being put out to sale. It's you asked about what sort of conversations happen. even during a structured sales process, you can have a bunch of conversations that, it's not like a USAID bid process where you can't talk to the client. You actually are encouraged to be able to speak within some bounds, and it actually matters whether you're doing it in Australia or the UK or the United States. But the point is that culture fit matters tremendously, both for the acquirer as well as for the firm being acquired. Now, there are some times, seldom, where someone just wants to sell and they are looking for and then they may not care about culture. Those are, to me, not value creating mergers. They're value destroying mergers. But by and large, in general, that is a key piece. And look, once that sale takes place, that is the beginning of the hard work. The hard work comes into that integration, being able to put together the quals, being able to understand each other's work processes. That's how you're going to be able to turn that acquisition into something worthwhile. Otherwise, we're in the consulting business. If people don't like what just happened, people walk out the door. And you could walk out the door if you are part of the company that just bought another company. You don't like the people that you bought, or you got bought by someone that you don't like. And there's value destruction that can happen in either case. So some of those very important intangibles need to be very well managed. And I think companies are getting smarter. There are different philosophies as to how you do it, but that's where the change management piece of it comes in.
Great. Well, Keith and Santiago, thank you so much for that insight. With that, let's pivot to bring in Edward Williams and get into some of these questions. So, and he's the partner at Williams LLP with offices in New York, London, and Monrovia, Liberia. Eddie, thanks so much for joining the show today. If we could start out with...
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. When a client comes to you, Eddie, and says, either I'm interested in selling or I'm interested in buying, what are some of the questions that come up or considerations that they should be thinking about at that point?
Well, the one big question that I ask is why, because then that drives everything else that we're going to talk about. Oftentimes when you I hate to be the killer of dreams, you come to a lawyer, you're excited, and lawyer said, well, what are you doing? And and it all falls apart. So I don't like doing that, but my job, and I think the way most lawyers see their job, is to say, let's think logically about what we want to do and why we're doing it. Because for all the reasons both of the speakers, both Santiago and Keith mentioned, you talk about cultural fit, all those things. Those are outside of legal, but those are really important things to consider when you're trying to discuss merger. So the first thing that I sit down with, talk about clients, is why you want to do this. Is there an economic reason, which may include, I want a larger market share. Well, what does that larger market share translate into ultimately on the books? And can this company really deliver what you think, what you have come to believe it can deliver? And so those are, it's an extended process. I've never done one that took less than 6 months, because you really have to do a deep dive. Of course, parties can always overrule the lawyers and say, hey, look, I've made up my mind, I'm done. Do it. At which point a lawyer sends out an email, says, you've made up your mind, you want me to do this, I'm doing this on your advice, and to avoid any issues later on. But the main question, the main query is why. Let's look at the books. Let's look at liabilities. They're out there. Let's look at potential liabilities. Let's look at how you draft certain clauses in terms of what's coming with you, what's staying with them. Let's look at the structure, whether it's a stock. Do you want to purchase just interest in the company? Or are you going to pay them cash, or is it going to be a stock exchange or something like that? So those are all sort of the things that we at a initial high level we discuss, and then as you get into the deal, as you see documents, you dive deeper into it.
And I think that's really helpful, Eddie, to think through. M&A isn't just, all right, let's do an acquisition, here's how you do it, but that there's different models and different things to think through in terms of which of those models would make the most sense. Could you talk a bit about best practices, either things that should be in place for a successful merger acquisition, or things that can go wrong? I guess even internally at a company or post acquisition is with the new larger firm.
Yeah, the biggest thing obviously is financials. And I don't mean that to say, well, is it making enough money or not making enough money? Whatever it may be, you just want to know that the financials you're being presented are accurate. In other words, if you look at the balance sheet, if you look at cash flow statement, if you whatever else they have, bank statements, so on and so forth. If you look at those, you then get a very clear picture of the company. And it may be that you're not keen on the financial as it stands now. Perhaps the company is developing a product later that's going to go to market that you want to be a part of. There's an upside there. But clarity as to what the company is, what the company does, where does it stand financially, what liabilities it has, how does it fit within what you're trying to accomplish, either long or short term. Those are the big things that come up. The second part of your question was what have I seen?
Yeah. And any cautionary tales or things to keep in mind if someone is looking to come down this route?
Well, a lot of what happens in this and sort of a recurring theme is that someone has worked, whether it's 5-10 years to build this company, and this company has been their life, and it's been part of their family, and you've missed your kid's birthday for this company and so on. And so you get to a point where it's scalable and you want to sell, and you do sell, and later you come back and say, I didn't want to sell my company. And then you tell me and the lawyer, well, can we come up with reasons why the sale shouldn't have gone through, or what happened there, or just let's create something that I want my company back. And of course it's gone. So I've seen that. I've seen a lot of lawsuits that arise from misrepresentation, whether it's negligent misrepresentation. Oh, I didn't mean to, I forgot, I should have included something, but I didn't. Someone bought the company, and now the company is not operating as it should. I've seen an instance, not in the context of an aid organization, but in the context of a restaurant. It was a restaurant purchased in New York that was doing really, really well with the previous owners. And they sold it, and the new owners just didn't have that thing that, drew customers, and people started to go away. The food was still the same in terms of the recipe, but the owners really created an environment that drew people in. And the new owners said, well, you misrepresented the numbers to me. And old owner said, well, no, that's, clearly here's what we were making. Here's how we ran the business. And it just turns out that, we can't sell you our essence, is how they put it. So, those kind of things come up. Another issue that come up is what's referred to as indemnification provisions. In other words, when you sell a company to another person, there are indemnification both ways, and oftentimes there's a dispute about the scope of that indemnification. How far did I intend to go? How far did I intend to indemnify you in terms of the risks that are out there? So.
Again, that's very helpful, Eddie, to kind of think through those details. We talk with a lot of clients in Europe and the UK who are interested in coming into the market. We talked about bootstrapping and acquisition. I think some look at bootstrapping and try to do organic growth, see that could take longer than they want, and then start looking at acquisition. Is there any special considerations if you are a European firm looking to acquire an entity in the US that either complicate it or are just unique to that type of a situation, as opposed to just a U.S. firm acquiring another U.S. one?
Yeah, well, you have to pay your lawyer more, so budget for that. And the reason for that is you have to look at regulatory systems on both sides of the transactions, on the side of whether it's an EU company wants to come into the US, or a US company wants to purchase an EU entity. The shortest way I know how to put it is it creates twice the amount of work in terms of the due diligence that has to be conducted, in terms of the regulatory compliance, if there are any. It may well be that these are two small mom and pop shops, that want to merge, then that's fine. There's not going to be a lot of work involved in terms of regulatory work. But if it's a larger entity, especially if it's in the aid space and they're trying to get to a certain place, ultimately trying to get to a certain place, there will be regulatory issues that has to be considered.
Great, thank you. And to wrap up, if we could bring on Christy here to kind of give us the so what. So Christy Hollywood's the Chief Operating Officer at Konektid, also former VP of Business Development at Cardno, a firm whose name came up earlier. Christy, as to our listeners who are on business development teams that establish partners, working with new USAID partners, what are some key takeaways from this conversation in terms of the so what in a couple minutes when they turn off this episode and get back to work? What are those key takeaways that they can bring, that are very tactical, that they could bring into their day-to-day?
Sure, there's a lot. I mean, I think cutting across all of our speakers today is really know your why. Beyond impact, know your why. It's a dynamic ecosystem. A lot of times we're so down in the weeds that we forget the market is changing around us, and to really consider that as you're thinking through what your growth strategy might be. Most folks start with organic. We're just going to try to keep building our pipeline, but thinking through why some other avenues like M&A might be useful. Thinking through, Santiago mentioned, if there's a founder exit coming up, if USAID in your specific technical areas or geographies is going bigger and bigger for what they perceive as low risk, whether or not it is. If there's a need for more investment than you can do as your currently sized firm, or if you really want to have a big acceleration in growth for other purposes. The other thing that really came across, I think, is that starting with prime sub relationships, like Keith was talking about going from an individual consultant to a small firm, and that really selling to the larger primes was the first place to start. So that you can gain that client knowledge and past performance in a documentable way that USAID will buy. Also thinking through prime and sub as a test run for that cultural fit, a complementarity of offerings. Those were things that really stuck out to me, as well as just when Eddie was talking, realize it's not a quick thing, that it takes at least 6 months, usually a lot more. Santiago was talking 18. And there's a lot of pulling back the curtain as you go through the process. I was talking to someone recently and their M&A deal fell through. But as we were talking, they're like, and that was a good thing. That's why we do that due diligence. Because that cultural fit and all those intangibles are also really important, as well as making sure that you have a full understanding of what you're getting into. And that you have your indemnifications and clauses that help you navigate if things aren't exactly what you thought going into it. I think those are all some of the things that I'm taking away today.
Great. Thanks so much, Christy. And thanks to all our guests. As we wrap up here, be sure to connect with everyone on LinkedIn. With Keith Ives, you can check out Causal Design's website. With Santiago, I think the best thing is to message him on LinkedIn. And then Eddie Williams, you can check out williamsllp.com or connect with him on LinkedIn. And then Christy, come to konektid.com, konektid.com, or send her a message on LinkedIn and let's connect with me as well. Thank you to all of you for your time. This is just really helpful. And I always enjoy having these conversations. I learned so much. So thank you very much. And everyone have a great day.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in to the Aid Market Podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and connect with Mike Shanley on LinkedIn to stay updated on the latest USAID funding trends.